Good afternoon, everybody. This is SEVA VentRounds, May 13, 2025. And today we're going to talk about a button of difference, just how little details matter. So the disclosures, there is no endorsement of any mode, ventilator, or manufacturer. Whatever we say, it's our opinion. It does not represent the Cleveland Clinic. My conflicts of interest are there, as well as Rob's. And remember, this is a recorded session, so just keep your microphone muted. If you want to say something, unmute yourself, but that way there's no background noise. Please use the chat function if you have other comments and you want us to comment on those. We love it. There's CRCEs for the respiratory therapy across the United States, so go for it. And I thought that I would start, and here I'm sure that Rob will have comments about this table for multiple reasons, but essentially one of the items that I like to think right now is about trigger and what are the variables that we use to trigger the ventilator. And the common ones that we use is the flow, meaning a change in flow detected by the ventilator will lead to the start of the breath. The other one is to use pressure. So a change in pressure will lead to a trigger. The airway pressure will lead to the initiation of the breath. We can use also the electrical activity of the diaphragm. So meaning that we have a sensor that is measuring the electrical activity of the diaphragm, and that will trigger the breath. And that's the only available on one ventilator, and it's with a catheter that we place on the esophagus. And then the last one, and that I would put out there, which it's not entirely clear when you read the instructions on the manual, but it's automatic. So some ventilators have some level of intelligence and rules that they are analyzing the waveforms, and then they will trigger the breath based on deformations that occur on the waveform, on the pressure or the flow waveform. And so I put it here as automatic, but it probably, and that's why I said Rob may have a better way of calling them, but and this one is currently one of the interactions, and the one that you're going to see today is the IntelliSync on the Hamilton ventilators. Rob, comments about this?
Go
ahead.
In fact, all of the variables in the equation of motion have been or are being used for trigger and cycle. So I would add volume. So
Excellent.
It is possible and has been done to trigger once you inhale a small volume, and a lot of adult ventilators still cycle off when the tidal volume has been delivered.
Wonderful. I would also add another within the automatic, and you remember this in the some types of non-invasive, that they use some prediction to see what's going to happen ahead. And what was the name of this on the non-invasive? Well, we'll come back to that. I won't digress for a second. But on cycle, we can use the flow, and this can be an absolute number. So that's a type of and we see that, for example, on PAB, which is not a percent of the peak expiratory flow, which is the common one that we see on mechanical ventilation. In PAB, actually, as implemented on the Puritan Bennett, is a amount of liters per minute that is left, and then it cycles off. Then the percent peak, which is probably the most common way to cycle. There's also the percent of the peak electrical activity of the diaphragm, which is fixed on NABAP, but it could be modified otherwise. I don't know if volume per se, Rob, is that also used to cycle?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, the servo ventilators, you set a tidal volume and it cycles off. The Dragers are like that too, I think. And if the flow is higher than necessary to deliver the volume, then you get an inspiratory hold.
Yeah,
it's complicated, right?
It is, but the interesting thing is that you can imagine as things get more complex, or you're dealing with adjusting ventilator settings, that having knowledge of how you trigger and how you cycle the breath may have impact on the terms of synchrony. And this case in particularly will, I mean, you'll see as we evolve. All right. So here is the tracing, and I think what I would ask you is to start looking at these waveforms. And just for those of you that have not seen these before, the mode is up here on the corner. This ventilator changes, puts this little triangle when it's a patient-triggered breath. And so that's important for us to be aware. So in this case, you see this little triangle tells you that that's a patient-triggered breath as interpreted by the ventilator. And it's pink because it's using the flow signal. That's how it's read. So as we go through this, anybody wants to, you can use the vent mode map to read this, or just by looking at the waveforms, what's the tag for this mode so that we can read the interaction a little bit better. And you can type it, or you can unmute yourself, either or welcome. And have no fear, this is a moment of testing yourself. You can put it on the chat. And if you're unsure, or you want to just put partial and say, well, I'm sure that this is pressure control, or I'm sure that this is volume control, you can start by putting that. Or this.
I'm sure this is pressure control.
Excellent, I love it. So this is definitely pressure control. That's the first thing that we see, and we know that. Great, Simran, also to see that. So we know that because the flow is different between each one of them, right? So that becomes very clear. There's not, and the tidal volume is changing between each one of the breaths. So definitely we're controlling pressure during the breath, and you can see it very nicely here. Simran and Fernando said, oh my, well, this is IMV, and they feel strong about that. And we have some hints to tell us that this is intermittent mandatory ventilation. We just by looking at the breath, we can certainly say that the first breath is mandatory. So this one that I put an M, and we know that because it's not patient triggered, and that immediately makes it mandatory. And there's another one here that it's actually mandatory. And then you have these three other breaths that you can see here that are triggered by the patient, and you know that because of the little triangle. And you can see that there is a absent, and it's cycling at different I times. So that actually makes it easier for us to know that this is actually spontaneous. So these three breaths are definitely spontaneous. So mandatory, spontaneous, mandatory, spontaneous, spontaneous. All right. And so that helps you know that this is IMV. And then the third part would be, what's the targeting scheme? What type of it is? And because I'm not an evil person, and I want to demonstrate to you, so I'm gonna, oh God, I didn't put it. Or did I sabotage myself? Yes, I did. Sorry. Well, I didn't show it, but you can live with it. So there's a mandatory breath, and then there's a spontaneous, and then again a mandatory breath, and then a spontaneous, and then a spontaneous, and you don't see another mandatory. And it continues to go, and then there's if you see this, what are the opportunities here? So Fernando says maybe this is type 1, but if this was type 1, we would expect another mandatory breath over here, and we do not see that. And actually what I was going to show you is that in the tracing is that all the rest of the breaths become spontaneous. So after this one, it's all spontaneous. So this is a type 2 targeting IMV, sorry, because all the breaths, once that all are spontaneous, then it becomes that we're suppressing, spontaneous breaths are suppressing the mandatory breaths. So that's for you to be aware. And then the targeting scheme, how do you know it is 2 versus 3? There, great question, Leora. So the only way to figure that out is to read the manual, basically for these ventilators. And there's sometimes that you can do some testing, but I would ask Rob to comment. The difference between 2 and 3 is what, Rob?
Well, 2, spontaneous breaths suppress mandatory breaths if the rate of spontaneous breaths is higher than the set rate. But for IMV3, it's not based on the spontaneous rate, but it's based on the total minute ventilation. So you have a minimum minute ventilation set by the tidal volume and the set rate. But if the spontaneous breaths increase the minute ventilation above that target, then you won't get any mandatory breaths. And the reason for that, or the rationale behind that, is that it avoids a situation where you have rapid, shallow, spontaneous breathing suppressing all the mandatory breaths, and you hypoventilate.
That's perfect. And Leora, I mean, just by looking at the waveforms, it would be hard to say that, to see that we know that there's currently, to my knowledge, only a couple of ventilators that do this. One of the modes is ASB or IntelliVent. Both modes do that, and the type 3. And the other one is mandatory minute ventilation on the Draeger ventilators. And there's other ventilators out there in the non-invasive world that also do this. But the best way is to use the Rosetta card or the vent mode map, because Rob has spent hours with Ping and the team to figure out when that's happening. In this case, it doesn't. You can see that the pressure is maintained for the spontaneous and the mandatory breaths. It's at the same height. So that also tells us that it's, and actually we know that this is set point, comma, set point. So meaning that we are setting the inspiratory pressure for both values. Rob?
That covers it. Very good.
Yeah. Now, I want to make you aware of and I put this here so that you can be aware of what's happening. So I always like to go through the settings when I'm putting a ventilator, because technically, if you're setting the ventilator, it would be very helpful for you to know every single button that it's in front of you. So the first one over here is the inspiratory time. So for the mandatory breaths, that would be the inspiratory time. You have the rate, self-explanatory, easy to understand. You have the change in inspiratory pressure. So this is the pressure that the patient gets with every mandatory and spontaneous breath. And you'll understand that in a second as we go through it. But this is the inspiratory pressure. Then you have over here the PEEP. You have the P ramp. This is the speed with which you do pressurize the system. So 0 means that it's a square. So you get up to the inspiratory pressure in 0 milliseconds. The larger this number is, the slower it gets to pressurize the system. This is the maximum pressure that the system will have. So you have to be aware of this and careful, because if you put it too low, this acts as an alarm. It will actually pressure limit your breaths, even if you're in pressure control. This is the cycle threshold. So the expiratory percent peak flow, so expiratory time sensitivity is set here at 50%. So that's the percent of the peak flow. So if I put the peak flow during inspiration, the breath is going to end up at 50% of the peak flow here, and the patient will exhale. Here's the flow trigger at 5 liters per minute, and here's the oxygen saturation for this patient. And then there is this little button that says P-Sync, and you see that it's activated. And when you activate the P-Sync, what it does is it turns it from a type 1, and I'll show you how it looks differently, but type 1 to a type 2 IMV, just by clicking this P-Sync. And if I had unclicked it, it would be type 1, and then I could set for the spontaneous breaths the amount of pressure support. This is for this mode in particular. So the key here is that you have to recognize that just by changing this button, by pressing this button, you would change the way that this mode behaves from a type 1 to a type 2 breath sequence. Rob?
Yeah, and just to add that Keep your eyes peeled because we're working on a paper that tells how to recognize these different types of IMV based on what the manufacturers say. And what they say, if you read between the lines, it says what the vent is doing, but of course they don't use our terminology. So you have to read what they say, think about what it means, and then classify it.
And this is not necessarily wrong. This is not a bad button in any shape, way, or form. It's just something that you need to know how it acts. All right. So now that I have gone through that, let's go back to our case. I don't see any questions right now, but what is the load right now? So what's the load for this patient? Elastic, resistive, or PMOS, or there's elastic and PMOS. So look at the waveforms. Because we're on pressure control, remember, we look at the flow waveform. I'm going to make it big for your eyes so you can see it. And you can see that each one of these markers is a second between these little. So what is the load? All right, I start seeing loads coming through. Very good. So yes, Fernando, definitely during inspiration there is a resistive load, and there's a couple. Well, during expiration, it's clear that there is a resistive load. You can see how long it gets to get to baseline, and a common thing that we hear, and I want you to be aware, is this little peak that you see here. So you see how fast it goes from the peak expiratory flow return, this little blip, I'm gonna say, from here to here. It would look like the time constant is very low, very short, and it goes back down. And then you see then how it takes a long period of time to get to baseline. Be careful, because this part that you're seeing here shows very low time constant, and that is the circuit, the ventilator circuit. It's decompressing in this case. And then after that, you see the actual long time constant, which is very prolonged. You see how long it takes to get there. Rob?
Yeah, that really is two time constants, because the patient circuit has a very low compliance and a very low resistance, very short time constant. And the area under the curve is basically the gas that was compressed during inspiration. It's a very small volume.
And so you can see how very little volume came out during the first peak. You see that, and then it takes a long period. So remember, the volume waveform is an amplification of the flow waveform, and it may show things clearer for you to see. So here's a clear example. You see how it exhales very rapidly, very little volume, and then it takes a long period of time. So these peaks over here, it's just the circuit. But during inspiration, there you go, Leora. Very high quality statement. So during inspiration, you see how the system pressurizes, the flow goes up, and then you see this stuff over here, the belly doesn't decay exponentially. You see that one over here too. You see that in this one and on this one. Instead of having that nice exponential decay, what you see is, so instead of decaying like that, you see those bumps, right? And so that means that there is PMOS. So during inspiration, there is PMOS, but during expiration is passive, and you clearly see a very high resistive load. Good job, Leora, in there. Good job. All righty. So now that you have seen these, let's go to the patient ventilator discordance. So what do you see? What problem do you see here? So during trigger, is the trigger normal, early, late, false, or failed? Good job, Simran. I'm going to erase your question mark. When you say something, say it with conviction. Definitely an early trigger. So you see a mandatory breath, and then you see evidence of PMOS. These two are early triggers. So you see the breath is triggered by the machine, and then you see evidence of PMOS. So that's one of them. Good. So I would highlight that's one of the items. There is a concern here, and so I'm gonna highlight this for you for a second. So come over here and amplifying this. And do you see how the flow is coming down, and then suddenly it crosses, and then there's this attempt, and then a little exhalation, and now come over here. And do you see how the patient does kind of an effort? So this little sunken thing here. So that may be the end-tidal CO2 is useful for us to highlight if there are, it may show the presence of failed triggers. It's a good way for us to amplify the signal. So I think that this one was going to be a failed trigger, and then the machine triggered the breath. But this was a failed trigger that it's hidden, and it fits, right? The patient has so much expiratory resistance, and then you see this little sucker here. Comments, Rob?
No, that's great. It's good to have that CO2 waveform.
Yeah, so there's it's hidden down there, and you'll see it a little bit more effective in a second. Then during inspiration for this breath, we are not gonna do any comment because the patient got an early trigger, but we can comment on these ones, and we can see that they're assisted breaths. And we say that they're assisted because we see PMOS during the breath with these breaths there. And so I would say that for all the other ones are assistance. In terms of for cycle, again, these ones we will not comment because they are already, remember, when whatever breath or event that happened here, we cannot talk about cycle. It's the first one is the one that you talk about. But on these breaths, do you think that in these ones that are over here and this one, is the cycle early, late, or normal for these three breaths that you have here? This one, and this one. Early, late, or normal for the cycle on these three breaths that you have here, because they were patient triggered, right? Yeah, I think that it's normal. I mean, we definitely know that this is not early because the peak flow is exactly, I mean, we don't see any evidence of PMOS during early exhalation. And it's cycling, so I don't see any early, any evidence of late cycle. So I agree with you guys, normal, definitely. Oops, sorry, normal. Very good. And then expiration, we saw it, and it's normal, but just it has a lot of PMOS activity. So the important thing here is, so when I saw this with the early trigger, can you go, so just to go back on the trigger question, could you point out what's triggering the spontaneous breaths? Yeah, so it's being triggered, the signal that the ventilator is reading is a flow signal. And we know that because of the triangle, the pink triangle. And what we see is that the flow crosses over, I'm gonna amplify on this one that it's over here, crosses over the baseline, reaches the threshold, and then the breath gets triggered. The flow crosses and triggers the breath. Does that help, Leora?
Maybe she means what's triggering the spontaneous breath during the early trigger breath.
Repeat the question, Rob.
On the one right in the middle where you see early trigger,
Yes.
maybe the question was what's causing the patient to inspire after the ventilator triggered the breath?
Yeah. So this early trigger, the theology of those are to be determined, right? But what I thought is that this is happens as a manifestation from awakening from sedation and evidence of sedation effect on the respiratory center. So that's what I would say, that this looks like a early trigger. The variety that is mentioned in the literature would be reverse trigger for these ones. Thank you, Rob. So I was trying to figure out how to better improve the synchronization, and I decided to press a button, and I pressed two buttons. So let me show you what I pressed. I activated the IntelliSync button, and so essentially I activated the automatic trigger and automatic cycling for the ventilator. And we recognize that now because it's blue. So you see here the little blue triangle. And the line, the blue line, means that it's going to cycle automatically. So now, instead of using the percent flow that I had said before and the liters per minute, now it's using the automatic detection threshold or system that it has that they call IntelliSync. And again, we're on the same mode. And actually, this shows it a little bit better than the other one. You remember that I told you that it was IMV2. And you can see a mandatory breath. And that mandatory breath has evidence of PMOS here. So this is another nice early trigger event. And then after that, you see that there's all these patient trigger breaths, and the mandatory breaths are suppressed. So it's IMV type 2, right? And then you can see that the breaths now are triggered by the machine, and I don't know what it's using. It's using its algorithm. I don't know if it's using flow, or it's using pressure, or it's using a combination of either or. I don't know, Rob, if you know what the machine uses for that.
I think that's proprietary. I don't think they describe it very well.
Probably they will never tell us for now. But you can see that all these breaths have different sizes based on the trigger and the.
Feel good.
I have you. Somebody can you mute me? Alicia, do you want to ask a question? All right, I'll mute her. So this is the algorithm now has changed to do that, to essentially allow the patient to get the breaths as they feel. And you can see that now all the breaths are being triggered by the patient. The breath rate is higher than what we have set as minimum. And it's getting all the breaths at 20 centimeters of water based on that algorithm. And I put this sequence that will make it even more evident for you. And you can see the patient is getting breath, then the patient doesn't trigger any breath, and then you get a mandatory breath, the patient triggers. This is another patient triggers, patient, mandatory breath, patient. So this is a type 2 IMV in which the patient will go into an apnea, not apnea, but it will not trigger, and boom, it gets a mandatory breath intermittently. So this is a 60-second event. And if I amplify the flow to see the amount of discordance, I mean, it looks pretty decent so far. There's one failed trigger here that it missed, right? But other than that, I don't see any problem with trigger and cycle in this case. We have used this before in other patients, but when there's cardiac oscillations, it becomes a disaster. Water in the circuit also does it, and they recognize it on the instructions on the manual. But I thought that it would be interesting for us to just simply talk a little bit about IMV type 2 and how just a simple button changed it, and then talk about cycle and trigger and some of the algorithms out there that may be, work or not according to your patient. Comments, Rob?
Yeah, just to be sure that people understand that P-Sync, that button, just determines whether it's IMV1 or IMV2, has nothing to do with trigger and cycle. So IntelliSync can be set to do trigger or cycle or both, right?
Correct.
And it has nothing to do with the type of IMV.
Yeah, and actually I spent some time at the bedside to the point that the nurse came and asked me, "Are you okay?" Because I was pressing buttons. And so just look at the variety that exists hidden within this mode. One, just by And I'm gonna erase all my arrows just for a second so that we can make it more evident for everybody. So if if P-Sync is not active, so this button can change it from IMB type 1 to IMB type 2, correct?
Yep.
You can change the cycling threshold from an automatic one, a proprietary mechanism, to using the flow and you can use for the flow trigger, for the trigger, it can be flow, it can be pressure, and it can be intelligent. And when it's intelligent, it changes a little bit how the mode will behave. It will be reading and the waveforms to minimize discordance. So there's an amount of I presume, and I wanted to ask you this, Rob, if this would fall into a level of intelligent targeting, because now we're using a different set of rules to modify the targeting.
It's a good question. We have to examine that closely.
So there you go. So buttons matter, and you need to dominate them on your ventilator. That's one of the key points that I would put. And I look at to see if there's any questions or comments in the audience if you want to unmute and ask for that. But buttons do matter. And we described and saw the difference for this patient between IMB type 1 and type 2. This patient in particular has severe COPD. I took these ones just before coming in today to give this lecture in one of our active patients. And the patient is waking up from a very high level of sedation. It was essentially placed because of the level of obstruction that the patient has, ended up in 3 medications for sedation: Versed, propofol, and fentanyl. And we stopped everything, and it's coming out. And so we want to maintain the minute ventilation, but we also want to minimize the interactions, the ailment interactions. And so we started with flow trigger. We were having some missed triggers, and we decided to use the intelligent algorithm to see how it would work for him. And so far, he seems to be synchronous. So buttons matter for all this sake. We described the difference between IMB type 1 and type 2. And perhaps here, Rob, I would like to just pause for a second and think about which patients would IMB 1 be better, and which patients, what would be the advantages of IMB type 1, and what would be the advantages of IMB type 2?
You asking me?
Well, since you talked, you're in, baby.
Well, my bias is to always use IMV type 2 if you don't need the mandatory breaths for sustained inflation and better oxygenation. If you have a patient that's very antsy and puts in a bunch of, small effort, spontaneous breaths, then your mean airway pressure may go down. You may get some alveolar collapse. And so if a person has a problem with oxygenation, it's probably not a good thing.
Excellent. Yeah, great point. And I would say IMB1, I mean, when I have used it in patients, when you have to have a minimum breath rate for whatever reason you want, perhaps inflation of the lung or a minimum minute ventilation of sorts, and you want to allow them to do, we have used this with a very low rate for size so that the patient will get a large breath and then breathe at whatever rate they wanted. So that's one of the possibilities. You can also think about IMB1, and we have used this in patients that have a very poor, we cannot use the airway signal to ventilate them. So patients that had huge leaks, by putting them on IMB type 1, you negate the trigger, and they will get the mandatory rate, and then it takes away the craziness of other ones. So you just put the pressure support at 0, and they will get the CPAP, and then they will get their mandatory breath. So that's another way that IMB type 1 may save you from some very challenging situations. And IMB 2, as Rob said, it's a great transition out of mandatory when spontaneous, and so you avoid some of the synchrony issues that you may see when you maintain a mandatory breath in there. And so when we are doing SATs and we're getting the patients out, this is a transition that can help us do that better. All right, questions from the audience.
Eduardo, this is Karsten.
Yeah.
This might be a silly question, but the table that you put up like at the first that was talking about the different triggers and cycles, yeah, flow, pressure. Where does time fall into this?
Oh, well, that's a great point. Yeah, so you can also cycle by time, right? And trigger by time. Thank you. Great
Good
point,
point.
Karsten.
Yeah.
Yoo-hoo! Karsten to the rescue. Yeah,
So-
and when time is the variable, then it becomes a mandatory breath, right?
Right.
Excellent point. Rob, any comments?
No, very good. I can't believe I forgot that.
Well, that's why we have Karsten around.
Right.
You mean a blind squirrel?
Uh,
Just happened to get a nut.
Well, this was a really really good comments. I hope that this helps you understand a little bit about as we get deeper on the ventilators. There may be functions that make the interactions with your patients better, and there's secret buttons that can help you improve those interactions. And so knowledge of the ventilator makes it better for you. Those are the QR codes for your CRCE and CME. Again, if you want to join us for the SEVA Summit, do register. And all our prior episodes are on the other QR code. As I invited at the beginning of the rounds to Vlad and the Aurora team in Milwaukee, send us your waveforms. That really enriches us, and there's a lot of stuff that we see that we can learn from each one of these. There is no waveforming which we cannot learn from. And so with that, thank you very much. Have a great evening and enjoy spring.
Thank you very much.